Before we get into today's story, Truth Report has launched a back-a-buddy initiative called Hold the Line for Warus. This is our 1 million rand drive to support the three sons of Warwick Stock, launched with the full support and consent of the Stock family as the official fundraiser. A trust is being set up for Warus's children through Honeycomb attorneys who have volunteered their services. If you're able to donate, thank you. If you can't, that's okay too. Sharing the campaign helps a lot. The link is in the description, or you can screenshot this QR code. Thanks for your support. Let's hold the line together. Now let's get back to today's story.
Good evening and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Respected ulama, community leaders, ladies and gentlemen, and viewers of Hilal TV, we welcome you to tonight's debate on behalf of IPCI and Markaz Mana Al-Fikr organizations, all protocols observed. My name is Luqman Shadrack. I'll be your moderator and host for tonight's debate on a very important topic, we can all agree, which is Israel's war since October the 7th. Is it justifiable or is it genocide? Now, some house rules before we start tonight's debate. We would like to create a continued awareness of the genocide that's been ongoing for over 76 years. This is definitely an emotional topic, and we request from the audience present here today to allow our speakers to get their points across. And we will have time a bit later in the session for a Q&A. You will have your opportunity to share your points and share your questions as well. So when October the 7th happened, I had the privilege of joining the Al-Quds Foundation, and we went to Egypt to cover that story. At that time, Western media was painting a very different picture of what was happening. So being on the ground gave us a very different perspective and a true perspective on what needed to happen from the aid from Egypt over the Rafah border into Gaza. I met brothers from Indonesia, I met brothers from Turkey, and they were waiting for weeks on end for that aid to be sent into Israel, or into Gaza, my apologies. They were intercepted by various organizations, and it was so amazing meeting people from Jordan who provided ambulances, because some of the ambulances were bombed. We had to provide tents to Gaza as well because some of the houses were bombed. So this is the type of effect the war had taken on both sides of the border as well. Our panel tonight, I'd like to thank them for making the time and coming through as well. I'd like to introduce one of our first guests, Brother Mark Oppenheimer, who has been a practicing lawyer and member of the Johannesburg Bar for 15 years. He has appeared in the Supreme Court in a series of cases that seek to determine the boundary between freedom of expression and genuine hate speech. He ran a widely televised hate speech trial against the EFF and Julius Malema for the infamous Kill the Boer song. We also have Brother Abdullah Andalusi. Ustad Abdullah is a British Muslim intellectual international speaker and co-founder of the Muslim Debate Initiative. For over 15 years, he has delivered lectures, debates, and training programs across the world on Islamic thought. Brother Abdullah has debated academics, politicians, atheists, Christian theologians, liberal activists, and Zionist advocates in Europe, Middle East, Africa, Asia, and North America. His goal is to equip Muslims with clarity, conviction, and the tools to navigate the ideological pressures of the modern world. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause to our two panelists. So tonight's schedule, we're going to start with a 7-minute introduction by each panelist. We then will continue with about an hour or an hour and a bit discussion from each panelist as well, where they will question each other's thoughts and opinions. And we'll then open the floor just before Maghrib, before our prayer time, to a few Q&A. We'll continue after, we'll break for prayer time and Maghrib, and then we'll continue afterwards with Q&A, and then closing statements from each panelist as well. So you're welcome to jot your points down. We'll have a mic present when the Q&A is going to happen, and we'll allow you to ask your questions. So gentlemen, I'd like to ask Mark to start first with your opening 7-minute discussion.
So thank you for joining us tonight. I thought it would be useful for us to have a discussion format instead of the sort of usual debate format. And we'll have many things to disagree on, but we intend on doing so politely. The question tonight is whether the war between Israel and Gaza can be justified or whether it's a genocide. And I'm going to be arguing that it's a justifiable war. And I think what we've got to remind ourselves on is why the war starts in the first place. So in international law, you have, war must be started for a just reason, and you must have justice inside the war. So the reason why the war is started is that it's a reaction to the events of October 7th. And I think it's important that we don't gloss over those events. So on October 7th, you have one of the most brutal attacks on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. You have 1,200 people who are murdered in some of the most barbaric ways that we've seen in modernity. You have extreme acts of sexual violence against men and women. There's a extremely disturbing case that's described by the New York Times about a woman who was gang raped and her breast was cut off while she was being gang raped, and the breast was then used as a football by those who were murdering her. You have cases of men whose penises were cut off and put in their mouths. You have cases of children who were kidnapped, 251 hostages in total. And as I say, not just the scale of the attack, but the barbarity that ensued means that when Israel declares its two war objectives, which is one, the eradication of Hamas to ensure that October 7th would never happen again, under conditions where the leaders of Hamas had said that they will do an October 7th again and again and again. In other words, you have a political organization that is determined to annihilate the state of Israel and its inhabitants. And then the second war aim is to recover its hostages. Now, the test for genocide in international law is that you must be aiming for the destruction in whole or in part of a people with what's called dolus specialis, which is a very particular form of intention, which means that it is the only kind of intention that can be determined from the conduct of what you do. So if it's plausible that another form of intention is there, which is, in other words, just war aims, then you cannot meet the legal requirements for genocide. If we think about genocides that are generally recognized, you have this annihilationist project. So, for example, if you think about the Armenian genocide, where under the Ottoman Empire, the Armenians I think it's about 1.2 million people are put on a death march with the aim of annihilating them on the basis of their faith. You had forcible conversions. You have mass deaths. The idea there is to destroy a people in whole or in part. If you think about the Holocaust, you have, a systematic killing of civilians on the basis that they are Jewish, not necessarily that they practice the faith, but that they were determined to be Jewish based on their bloodlines. You have a coordinated strategy by the state to do this. It happens over a long period of time. And you have the annihilation of 6 million people. So if we look at what happens in the war, we see that we don't have any of those features. So you don't have the state of Israel saying that they intend on annihilating the Palestinians as a people. I noted that the moderator started off by saying that there's been an ongoing genocide for 76 years. The Israelis must be the worst genocideers in history because the population in Gaza has only risen over time. If you're a genocideer, you would be trying to annihilate the population. must also accept that the Israelis have the capacity, the military capacity, to kill every single person in Gaza, and they haven't. Instead, what they've done is to warn civilians of strikes, to ensure that their targeting is aimed at military targets. The rules in the laws of war are such that you cannot deliberately target civilians, but you are entitled to attack a military target, knowing that there will be civilian casualties, provided that is proportionate in the circumstances. And the way the proportionality is determined is that you look at the impact that it could have in terms of the loss of civilian life versus the gain that you'll get militarily. And the gain might be in relation to the particular enemy combatants that you can kill in that strike, and also the deterrent effect. So, as I say, when you have a body like Hamas declaring that it will perform on October 7th again and again and again, one is that it's a legitimate target to annihilate that group, and also to signal to other groups in the region like Hezbollah that there will be swift vengeance in the form of military action against military targets to prevent further attacks. One of the things that wasn't discussed much during the war was the fact that 200,000 Israelis were driven from their homes because of attacks in the south from Hamas, but also from Hezbollah, who were firing rockets which couldn't be defended against through Israel's military defense system. And so many Israelis then had to live in refuge. Ultimately, the Israelis had to fight a war on many fronts because there were not just attacks from Hamas and Hezbollah, but also from Iran. They were able to rely on their friends in the Abraham Accords. So the Jordanians, for example, helped shoot down Iranian rockets. The peace with the Egyptians also was maintained. And if we look at the sort of conclusion of the war, we see that the Israelis were able to achieve much of what they wanted, which was the release of all the hostages. There's only one body that is left behind. And the large dismantling of Hamas with a peace deal that would ensure that the remaining members of Hamas will put down their arms. So if we look at the totality of those events, we can see that if the Israelis really did want to annihilate the Palestinian people as a people, they haven't done it, even though they could have. They've lived up to their war objectives. And we now have a ceasefire that may lead to peace in the region, which would be good for everybody, because every loss of civilian life is tragic, and I don't think anyone wants it to continue.
Now, Mark, who proudly identifies as a Zionist, chose the topic of today's debate on whether Israel's actions in Gaza are justified or genocide. Presumably, he thinks that in the face of the dead, the open genocidal rhetoric of the Israeli cabinet and ruling coalition ministers, and most of all, the endless stream of photos and videos, many filmed by Israeli soldiers themselves, of unarmed civilians being shot, of babies with bullets in their heads, of bodies upon bodies dead after airstrikes, key buildings that support life in Gaza, like water treatment plants, being blown up by gleeful Israeli soldiers in controlled demolitions, with no enemy there, of course. And now, increasingly, photos of recently uncovered mass graves of hundreds of Palestinians. Mark here probably thought that this may give Israel a bad image. And racial supremacy can't have a bad name, can it, Mark? Of course, we have seen such a desire to defend the image of racial supremacy in supremacist regimes before. You South Africans have seen it yourself. After the Soweto protester uprisings in 1977 were brutally suppressed, 575 deaths, 3,900 wounded, the world was horrified. Of course, the white supremacist regime like Mark here wanted to try to explain and justify their actions in the name of their racial supremacism. They officially initiated an internal investigation, much like Israel does when its troops get caught on camera killing unarmed civilians, like recently those 2 cases. Unsurprisingly, like Israel and its advocates, the apartheid South African regime found that the government and the police were not to blame for the killings of the South Africans, despite the fact that they were doing this in the name of suppressing the South African desire for self-determination of the native population. Israel is an exceptional, unique state. It is a state with the longest military occupation in the world. No other people except the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza have been subjected to military occupation and officially classed as stateless people for that long in all of modern history. When Putin invaded Ukraine and took over areas of Ukraine, at least he gave the people there automatic Russian citizenship with passports. Obviously not so Israel. According to Zionism, Palestinians must be denied their right to self-determination according to international law, and in case it wasn't clear to everyone, Israel passed a constitutional law in 2018 reaffirming the right to exercise national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. No other liberal democracy since apartheid South Africa has race-based laws giving automatic citizenship to one race or ethnicity except Israel, like the so-called law of return that gives anyone coming to Israel automatic citizenship under the principle of birthright or ancestry, but denies that to Palestinians despite the fact that they have birthright and ancestry in the same land. Explain that one. And this is despite the UN Resolution 194 that grants all 750,000 Palestinians and their descendants who were expelled from 500 villages on Israel's creation the right to return back. They're refused because they don't belong to the right race. Within the occupied territories taken by Israel in 1967, Palestinians are subject to a brutal occupation, apartheid, control of borders, home invasions by soldiers at night under the policy of making their presence felt, being shot for the slightest suspicion, like 13-year-old Imam al-Hams in 2004, who was shot going to school because she dared to go near 70 meters away from an Israeli checkpoint. Her wounded body was then approached by an officer who emptied his magazine into her point blank to confirm the kill, quote unquote, and he was absolved in Israeli courts as just following policy and orders. Palestinians can be arbitrarily arrested and held for administrative detention for 6 months, but renewed indefinitely. Before October 7, 1,320 Palestinians were currently held hostage in administrative detention under military rules in the West Bank. Rules and laws remind you that the West Bank Palestinians can't vote. They are under laws like Military Order 101 that criminalizes criticism of the State of Israel, even the displaying of Palestinian flags, with punishments up to 10 years in prison. These are laws they didn't vote for, by the way, because it's military occupation. The NGO Adamir documented 5,200 political prisoners in Israel and Palestine, West Bank, before October 7. All this is what Zionism requires to implement over a people for 57 years, the denial of their self-determination. Now being denied the right to self-determination, it is many international laws, including those resolutions passed by the UN, affirm the legitimacy of people to struggle for their independence by all means, including armed struggle, like UN Resolution 3103, 3743, and of course 1514 actually says it's illegal for an occupier to use violence against an occupied people. Accordingly, this would apply to Palestinians too. Therefore, Israel, like South Africa, does not have a right to defend itself against those it's still occupying and oppressing, any more than a rapist has a right to defend himself against the blows of a woman trying to struggle out of his perverted grasp. We know that Israel lied about the atrocities on October 7th, and their ministers have demonstrated genocidal intent, blaming all civilians and invoking the biblical genocidal references to Amalek, which we will explore further to show they have genocidal intent against the Gazans until most of them leave. They don't need to kill all of them, because genocide can be in whole or part, but to kill as many Palestinians as possible to get them to leave Gaza. Thank you. I rest my case here.
I'm sure the audience has taken note and can always ask those questions a bit later during the Q&A. We're going to ask Mark to start with our debate. And Ustad and Mark, you're welcome to go back and forth with various topics that you'd like to discuss.
So if you put the volume up a bit, just because I think it's not, so we can both be heard, yeah? Okay, go ahead, sorry.
That's good.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me try and address a couple of the issues that you raised. So the first is this strange notion that people have about Israelis being white and looking like Woody Allen. if you spend any time in Israel, you realize quite quickly that it is one of the most racially diverse countries on the planet. That you have, firstly, black Jews from Ethiopia. You have an enormous number of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, who were expelled from those countries in the 50s. About 800,000 were forcibly removed. Those countries which were sort of diverse places with Christians and Jews and Muslims and Druze are no longer that way. So the idea that, the Israelis want a Jewish supremacist state, but all the other surrounding Arab countries are, pluralistic places where Jews and Christians can participate in government, and be free from abuse, just isn't the case. So you have a society that's very racially mixed and very religiously mixed. So there are, Arab Israelis who are Muslim and Christian, who are in government, who are in courts, who operate hospitals, some of whom were the targets of attacks on October 7th. So as I say, the idea that you have a sort of racially ethnic state just strikes me as incorrect.
But is it incorrect, though? At 1947, was Israel diversely mixed? Who were the first Zionists that set up the state of Israel? Were they all from the Arab countries? Were they all a mix of Ethiopians and everyone saying Kumbaya? Or were they 99.9% Russian Jews, German Jews, French Jews, English Jews, Jews from Europe? Ben Gurion, that's not his original name, though he changed it just to sound Hebrew, I suppose. But they were from East Europe. Chaim Weizmann, again, not from the Middle East. So the people who set up the state of Israel, on its establishment, the vast majority were Jewish Europeans, not Middle Easterns and Eastern Easternism. And that came a bit later. So is that not misrepresenting the initial colonial vision of the state of Israel set up by European Jews, was it not?
Yeah, so I think describing it as a colonial vision is bizarre. Firstly, you had Jews living in Israel for hundreds of years. So you've had Jews living in...
They're called Palestinians.
Yeah, you're right. So in other words,
right.
There are Palestinians who are Jews, who are described as Jewish Palestinians and have lived there for, as I say, hundreds of years. The idea that if you think about a colonial project, so if you look at what European powers do in Africa, you are setting up a colony where there is no ancestral connection to the land. This is very different from the Israeli project, in other words, where you have Jewish ruins, you have a temple, you have currency with menorahs on it. There's clearly a long history of Jews being present in the region. So to say when they return that they're engaged in a colonial project just seems like a slur as opposed to something.
I didn't say colonial project. I just said that in essence that wasn't in my presentation. I was just merely saying that they were disproportionately Europeans who came and set up the state of Israel based on European notions of nationalism and also secular democracy. So they came with a secular vision. Many of them were atheists, the vast majority were atheists, just like yourself. Socialists. They didn't care whether they thought the Bible was a book of stories and fables, not the basis for rules and laws. I'm not saying that European Jews don't have a connection. When I say connection, I mean some ancestry over 2,000 years ago to the land of Palestine. I'm simply saying that after 2,000 years of intermarriage and living in Europe, they're a different nation altogether. Genetically, they're as much European as they are anywhere from the Middle East, whereas Palestinians who never really left that land are at least 100% Middle Eastern and 70% linked to Canaanite DNA, which date back from 4,000 years. There was genetic studies have shown this. So these are the natives that never left. Why do people from Europe, who are as much as they are Middle Eastern or wherever, have a better right to rule the land of Palestine than the people that never left and stayed there for all those thousands of years?
Well, I suppose a couple of things. The one is that, this is sort of off topic.
It's on topic because it speaks to the legitimacy. Because every time people talk about the right of Israel to exist, or whether criticizing Zionism is effectively eliminating or denying the Jewish right of self-determination, these kind of arguments are brought up. So I think it's quite personal, but before we'll get into obviously the main topic again, but I think it's important to understand.
Yeah, all right. So I mean, I suppose one question is, why did these Europeans have an interest in this location in 1947? Well, we can go back, a couple of years and sort of know that you had this annihilationist project in Europe where 6 million Jews were killed.
So
And
Zionism was started in 1939, the beginning of World War II. That was the beginning of Zionism.
no, Zionism starts with Herzl. So like Zionism.
So it
has a
starts
British-
50 years earlier, before Holocausts and Nazi Germany, right? Just to
starts with the
clarify.
Dreyfus Affair.
Right.
So in other words, what you have is a realization among Jews in France that the French society, which seemed like a sort of accommodation society where Jews had prospered, was no longer going to be that way, and that the one way to prevent the pogroms that were happening in Eastern Europe and the attacks on Jews in Europe and Western Europe was to have a state. And if you sort of look at the nature of how states develop at that time, states are a reasonably modern invention. They often start with the idea of, well, is there a people, who have a common set of values or principles or whatever it is, and they form a group together. And the idea that you could have, I mean, obviously there were debates about where that state should be. One of the questions was, should it be in Uganda? The idea was that the threats against the Jewish people are important and you can protect yourself by having a state. Jews were accused of being a stateless group and were persecuted on that basis. And so they then set up a state of Israel. And as I say, you have the Jews who'd been living in the region for hundreds of years, and you have the Europeans who come in. And then you have this swathe of Jews who come in from North Africa and the Middle East in the 50s. You have the Ethiopians.
But that's
who come
after the
out
state of Israel was created. We're going, like, what started Zionism in the first place was
Yeah.
they thought that they could take the land of, well, eventually they agreed that they'll go for Palestine, and they thought they had a better right to rule it and ignore the rights of the native peoples, who are the majority. I mean, do you not believe that everyone has an equal right to self-determination? Right?
Well, hold on.
Do you not believe that?
It's an interesting line that you have, because
Right.
if you look at this room, there are I would think, maybe none. Not a single person in this room is native to the land of South Africa, right? Depends when you want to start, right? So you have Dutch people who come in 1652. You have,
No. Wait.
yeah, so you've got the Khoisan and probably got the best sort of claim for it. You have people who've come from Malaysia. You have people who've, come from all parts of the world. And the general idea is that you have a right to live here. This is your country.
So you can illegally, I can illegally immigrate to South Africa and have automatic, native rights here.
Well, we don't have illegal
Or
immigration.
do I not require the consent of the representative government that represents the people to be allowed to be a legal migrant? So I need to ask permission to come in. Is that not the case?
So tell me, who was the ruler of Palestine that they should have asked in 1947?
So, not 1947.
In other words, if you wanted to ask a state,
They approached Britain before Britain even controlled Palestine. Right? There was, the Balfour Declaration was done before the British actually took over Palestine. So they gave them a promise that, well, if Jews support us, and that's how, because they were anti-Semitic, they thought all Jews were the same, or they had a network. That was the irony. Anti-Semitism was leveraged to get Zionists what they want. So the British government promised something to a people that they never controlled that land, by the way. And secondly, was the British government never actually promised a state as well. They just said a homeland for migration, and we'll see if by the time of independence, Jews are European Jews or immigrants are the majority enough such that then once they have a full democracy, they would then have what they call external right to self-determination. But in 1947, when the Britain was considering leaving and obviously going from Palestine, who were the majority of people in Palestine? Who were they?
Well, you have a variety of different people there. If you go and read the original Israeli Declaration of Independence, what you have is the recognition that there are a variety of people who live in the region and that all of their rights should be respected. And when Israel declares independence in 1947, and it's recognized by all the members of the United Nations at the time, so it gets legal recognition, you then have all of the surrounding states declare war on Israel. And so instead of the Israeli vision of a pluralist society where you have Jews, Muslims, Christians, and Druze living together under one state, instead what you have is this sort of bloodshed that ensues, and those who'd escaped the Holocaust then have to fight for their survival again, and you have hundreds of thousands of Israelis die. Now I sort of wonder, first, as you say, like you should ask permission from the state in which you are going. There is no prior Palestinian state. You have the war that occurs. If you use the sort of ordinary principles of international law, so uti potendis juris, what you would do is work out what the state lines are of the country based on its prior administrative borders. So as you mentioned, you've got the British Mandate, you have Transjordan, which is sort of separated off and is now the state of Jordan, and arguably the state for the Palestinians. 70% of people who live in Jordan are Palestinian, although ruled by Hashemites, Hashemite minority. And then you have the war, and the Jordanians occupy the West Bank. And you then in 67 have a further war. The West Bank is recaptured, and the Jordanians then cede all rights.
So the West Bank is recaptured.
Yes.
So when was it previously captured?
It's captured by the Jordanians in the War of Independence. So if you look at the original war,
Was it recaptured by the Israelis? When did the Israelis ever control the West Bank? So before in 67.
So if you look at, as I say, uti potendis juris is the way to determine what the boundaries of a state are.
Yep.
You should look at the borders of control beforehand. So you should look at whatever the borders are for the British, which includes the West Bank.
Okay, can we talk about uti potendis juris? So let's go back a bit, because you said a bunch of things, and I didn't want to interrupt you because I wanted you to obviously elaborate. So yes, the state of Israel has in its constitution a recognition of and tolerance to plurality, you could say, of people's different religions and races might live there. That's true. No one argued that they didn't believe that. And no one argued that Israel intended that they'll create a colony state with only one ethnic group. America was a colony state, and they brought a whole bunch of different ethnic groups over. Still a colony state still, though. But here's the issue. In 1947, 2/3 of the population were who?
In 1937.
In Palestine. Who was 2/3 of the population of who?
I assume it would be the various Arab groups that were there.
So the Palestinians. Okay, good. We're making progress.
Well,
so
let
me continue.
So straightforward.
Sorry?
To say the Palestinians is not so straightforward. In other words, the term Palestinian is a political term. That
non-Jewish Palestinians. Is that a suitable category? We just say non-Jewish Palestinians then. All right? Okay. So they were 2/3 the majority. So if they're 2/3 the majority, and the state of Israel was created, did not Ben Gurion say, when he looked at the initial UN partition plan, which was actually a recommendation, it was not binding, and it was up for England or Britain to adopt it. When he looked at the initial partition for the Jewish state that was going to be partitioned off, which got 55% of the land, even though they're only 1/3 of the population, the Jewish population or the immigrant population, he said we can't have a viable state with 40% being Arabs, as he called it. Can't have a viable state because the Arabs will always be the brokers of power in any election. They're the ones that decided. And of course, according to Zionism, it's Jews that must determine their own destiny, not anyone else being involved in that. So after the ethnic cleansing that occurred, called the Nakba, 1948, 1949, how many Arabs were left in the state of Israel from this 40%? How many Arabs were left?
Well, I think firstly to describe it as
percentage-wise.
So what you must look at, of course, is that Israel is attacked in 47. You have a war.
No, Israel was attacked by who? Which army attacked Israel in 1947?
The Egyptians, the Jordanians.
No, that was 6 months later. There was no Arab armies in 1947.
Well, no, in other words, the war starts in 48, right? So you have the Declaration of Israel.
When do military operations, who was the first person that began military operations? Which side began actual military operations in the land of Palestine in 1947, 1 month after the UN Declaration? Do you know who?
Do you want to tell me?
You didn't research it? You're meant to be an advocate here. Why am I giving you a history lesson for? Okay.
I mean, we're debating a different topic.
It's it's the Haganah, right? And the Irgun Lehi, which are terrorist organizations. They all become amalgamate into one, and they become one force, and they begin ethnic cleansing operations. Actually was because of about 5 months later, the Arab states complained that there was a whole bunch of Palestinians streaming out, and they make official declaration to the UN from the Arab League saying, there's all these people streaming out, massacres and so on. We have to come in to restore order because these people are already streaming out. They're already running away. They're being, you could say, genocided back then. And then they came in and they said their aim is they want to create a one state with everyone their equal rights and democracy. Who said no to that? Who refused that? And who refused that when it was discussed amongst the UN? Why not have a one state? It was the Zionists. They don't want equality. They don't want equal democracy. when they are the minority. So it's not equal rights. Well, much like the apartheid South African, the National Party, they said we can't be a minority. For us, this will be a cultural genocide or what have you for ourselves. We have to be the ruling, even though they were the minority. So is anything I said not factually the case according to your reading? Am I misrepresenting in any way?
So firstly, the idea that the surrounding Arab states just wanted, peace between the different peoples is untenable given how minority groups have done in Arab states. So I mentioned earlier that you have Islamic-only states. If we sort of zoom out of the map of the region, Israel takes up a lot of space in your newspaper, a very small amount geographically. It's about the size of the Kruger National Park or New Jersey. What does it look like ethnically diverse there? How many Jews and Christians and Druze are in positions of power in those other Arab nations? You want to tell me?
Well, it depends how far you go back in history, but
Let's look now.
There's actually been there's been quite a few. Saddam Hussein, for example, had a Christian minister under him and so on. You could look at different parties and times, but I don't want to divert to the topic.
How many Christians are there then
because when you said that there are Middle Eastern Jews in Israel and they came from the Arab countries, so presumably it was almost like 900,000 Jews from the Middle East. They migrated to Israel. Israel was telling them to come. They literally was campaigns that we need to fill spaces. Come to Israel. 900,000 from the Middle East. So presumably then there were 900,000 Jews in the Middle East prior to the state of Israel, not killed, massacred, or empty. They didn't just pop out the ground and migrate. They were there for thousands of years alongside their Muslim and Christian counterparts. Is that not the case?
Well, did they
So is it not the case that Israel then brought sectarian racial strife to the Middle East because it didn't exist before that?
Well, no, what you had, you're the alleged egalitarian and you think everyone should have equal rights. Tell me, under Islamic law, do Christians and Jews have equal rights to Muslims? That was allowed.
Wait. So this is the canard, but I'll entertain it. So Islamic law, there are the only citizens in an Islamic governmental state or in the Ottoman states are actually the non-Muslims. They're the only citizens. Jews, Christians, others. They have a contractual arrangement with the state. That's what a citizen is. You have I give you some tax, and you give me protection, and so on and so forth. But they were given full autonomy, your own law courts, even your own police forces, which you don't even get that in liberal states. Muslims were not citizens in the Islamic State. They were subjects of the state. They had to fight in wars, whether they liked to or not. The non-Muslims were not expected to fight in wars because it wasn't expected that they would fight for a cause or under a system that maybe they didn't believe in as a religious perspective. So we never forced them.
So what you have is differential treatment.
So non-Muslims are actually the only citizens in an Islamic government.
But you have differential treatment, in other words. So your claim is that you think differential treatment is justifiable. Different rules for different groups. It's odd to come here and sort of denounce apartheid and say, it's terrible that you had these race-based laws, and then say, but the ones that we had in the Islamic countries, well, they were good laws.
Well, do you know what the laws the Christians and Jews were under in the Ottoman Caliphate? Do you know what laws they were under? Were they under racially discriminating laws? Were there places they couldn't go? They were under their own laws. Jews were under Jewish law as they determine it to be. Christians were under Christian law as they choose it to be. They choose their own laws. Do people have that same right here? No. All right? Anyway, going back, because we're diverting and we need to go to the topic here. So, do you think it was a injustice that 750,000 Palestinians that were evicted or you think left on holiday for some reason, 1947, 1948, do you think it's injustice that they are not allowed back into their original towns and villages from where they came in the land of Palestine? Or do you think it was justifiable they could be kicked out and not allowed to return against UN Resolution 190?
Well, what you had was signaling from the surrounding states saying, we are going to wipe out this nation state of Israel. We suggest that you leave, and we'll of course conquer them because they're a small nation. And then you'll be.
Where did they say to the Palestinians there, we suggest that you leave? Which official communication? You can't find any official communication, any documented so-called this ghostly radio broadcast that no one could find any record of. Don't you find, in fact, Syria and Lebanon and Jordan telling the Palestinians not to leave because it was causing disruption, and they were vacating and giving the land to the Zionists? In fact, it was the opposite. They're saying, don't leave. And they were even accused of being traitors for leaving, right, by these various regimes. So that's not true. You should stop drinking the Zionist Kool-Aid because it's not accurate.
Just to pause. So the topic of our discussion today is on the current war. So we can do this Israeli history thing, and I think it's important that people have a sense of it. But you haven't, just to place on record,
you didn't say if it was justified or not. That 700, the 250,000 Palestinians and their descendants are still prohibited from going back to their towns and villages. You haven't answered this. Do you think it's justified or not? Do you think it's right that they should be denied their right to return back to their ancestral villages?
Well, how many of those individuals still persist? We're talking about an event that happened in 1947.
Oh,
so in other words, I would imagine that the claim is not, the right of return claim is not that those particular individuals who have a claim against the state say, I want compensation or I want access. That's not the claim. The claim is that all of our descendants have a claim. That's a very unusual claim. And
it's an unusual claim. So European Jews separate by 2,000 years from Palestine, they have a claim, but the Palestinians, by only one generation, don't have a claim. Does that make sense?
well, that they have a claim because the state is set up. They have a claim because the state is set up and, recognized by the UN. That state has, the right of, okay. That state has the right to set up its rules in terms of who it'll allow in for citizenry. I'll wait for you to get your mic on. Thank you. Good.
According to most liberal democracies, even liberal, let's take liberal democracy. Israel's a liberal democracy. So if you can claim at least that you are the grandchild of a citizen, you can have the ability to have citizenship in that state given to you because you can claim descent. So the vast majority of Palestinians today, many of them are grandchildren at the very least of that place, and they were forcibly evicted. So that doesn't matter because it overrides. If you're forcibly evicted, it might go a few more generations. So your argument legally doesn't make sense, but you still haven't answered why 2,000 Jews that were separated from 2,000 years from that place intermarried with Europeans, so they're basically half European according to DNA studies, why they have a better right than Palestinian natives to go back to their ancestral homes.
Well, firstly, there's no predecessor Palestinian state, right? So in other words, those people who lived in the land don't have a claim against the state to say, you must give me a right of return. You have a new state that forms. So the Ottoman Empire is dissolved. There's no claim against the Ottoman Empire.
You have after they get. They don't get kicked out during the Ottoman Empire. They get kicked out by this nascent state of Israel. They get kicked out, and the UN Resolution 194 affirms their right to return, which the Israeli representative to the UN, Eban, affirmed as kind of like a precondition to Israel even joining the UN. The UN said, are you going to affirm Resolution 194 to allow the return of refugees and others? And they said, yes, we give the affirmative, they said. And of course, they lied about it and didn't care about it afterwards. Is that not the case?
All right, so I want to speak a little bit uninterrupted for a bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me try and distinguish your
So,
claims.
Mark, before you begin your next point as well, ladies and gentlemen, as I requested earlier on as well, we want to make this an intellectual debate. We want to respect each person's view. So booing and whistling, that type of thing, I'd like to maybe ask you to stop doing that. You're welcome to clap. You're welcome to share your views, your opinions, but you will have that opportunity a bit later during our Q&A. So the booing and the whistling, I'd like you to please stop, if you don't mind. Okay, agreed? But we've asked everybody before we started to kindly respect.
Okay.
I am going to open, hold on, sir. So you may have come in a bit late. Okay, when we started, I said we will have a Q&A after this debate. Are we clear? But you don't know that, sir. We haven't started the Q&A. Okay, so we'll have a Q&A just after this debate. As we said earlier, if you are not able to control yourself, we're going to ask you to leave so that we can continue. Thanks, Mark. You can continue now. Excuse me.
How's that sounds? Audible?
Sure, no problem. We'll ask the sound guys to do
All
that.
right. Okay, so let me try and get back on track. All right, so I think there's a couple of claims. So the one is, in other words, what right do the Jewish people have to the territory? And so what I've said is that they have it's an ancestral homeland, and then you have a legally created right through the United Nations. The separate question is there a right of return for those Palestinians who, let's say, lived in the territory, become refugees? And as I say, that's sort of the state itself, the new state, just gets to determine, what its rules are on immigration. And, you could have a compensation scheme, for example. You could say, some land must be swapped out. There's an ongoing debate with what do you do with this sort of territory? What do you do with these claims? As I point out as well, that of those who actually resided there aren't going to be 700,000 anymore because it's from 1947. So you're talking about, more than 75 years ago. So you could have a limitation of the claims. And as I say, the Palestinian claim is much more broad than that. It's that all descendants have a right of return. Now, if we just think about the movement of people between nations, as I mentioned, you had 800,000 people from the North Africa and the Middle East who aren't asserting a claim to say, I want my home in Baghdad back. You had a very vibrant Jewish community in Baghdad, and they have accepted that, through the passage of time, that they have now moved and they live somewhere else. And you don't have that. What you've had is that you've got two sort of different Palestinian communities who've emerged and created lives for themselves in the West Bank and in Gaza. You've had some who've left to go to other countries and started lives there. You've had many population groups who sort of moved around and have sort of, longings to be back in places. But the idea that the Israelis don't have a right to exist legally obviously is untenable. But I just want to point out that the topic that we signed up for hasn't been answered. So I want to try and just get us back there. I understand the nature of Israeli debates is often, you go back in history and you want to sort of make a claim. What we've asked ourselves is about a particular legal answer to what's going on in that war. And as far as I can tell, you haven't denied the sort of horrendous actions committed by Hamas. One thing I'd like to know is whether you think any of that stuff justifiable. You mentioned two things in your opening statement. The one is you claim that Israel has no right to defend itself because it's an occupying power. Now, Article 51 states that states have the right to protect their own citizens against any attack.
Against where, sorry?
Against any attack. Now,
against foreign states, right?
The way that it's phrased doesn't say that. It just says any
so
attack.
So is Gaza and West Bank a foreign state?
Well, so this is an interesting question. So what you have, obviously, is that the Israelis withdraw from Gaza in 2005. Okay, you have almost total sovereignty in Gaza since that period of time. So you have, in other words, an elected government. Hamas killed.
So Gaza was not an occupied territory according to international law, according to the ICJ, especially with that ruling on the Gazan wall. What they said is, the borders are controlled. Their fishing territories controlled. Their sovereign territories in the maritime territories are actually controlled. Airspace controlled. So what goes in and out is controlled. So if the ICJ said this amounts to occupation, so are they not still occupied territory till this day? Or up until October 7th?
Debate about it. I mean, I think
you think the Palestinians view Gaza as a separate state from West? It's like Russia retreats from Kherson in Ukraine, and then the Russians say, "Why are the Ukrainians still fighting me? I retreat from Kherson." Right, and the Ukrainians even use Kherson to continue fighting as a launch pad to continue fighting Russia. Say we withdrew, and look, they're still fighting us. That means the Ukrainians aren't interested in peace. Right? That's how ridiculous you sound when you make that argument.
Yeah, that's just said.
All right, but also something else. So he said, well, the issue of the right of return of Palestinians, even though it's affirmed internationally, in international law, of which Israel is a signatory to the UN and accepted that premise, Resolution 194.
Okay. Sorry, sir.
No, I'm
sorry, sir.
Well,
I'm going to ask you if. Sorry, sir. You will have an opportunity to share your question, but for now, hold on, sir. Excuse me. We will try and adjust the volume, but it's not purposefully done. Okay. You have, but don't shout at me. I'm addressing you respectfully. We've asked the sound guy to adjust it, but Mark and both Ustad moves away from the mic. So it's no fault of anybody right now. We will try and adjust their mic, but address your question calmly and politely. Okay, thank you.
Can I do a
Okay.
little audio test? Is that,
Yeah.
can people hear me? Is that good? Okay, and now it could be me. I'm a little soft-spoken. Does that sound better? Okay.
Just make sure.
Okay, so we have a
Yeah, so-
monitor where we monitor the sound.
Yeah.
And on the monitor, the sound is okay. So it could be that he's moving away. Both gentlemen are moving away from the mic. We'll try and adjust it, but that shouldn't be an issue, sir.
Sure.
The lecture is actually why we're here today. Okay? Thank you.
All right, just finish my thought, and then we'll go on to, I suppose, the what happened October 7th and beyond that. So, you said that the state of Israel, once it was established, it has, and a couple of years later was really when it discussed a right of return, these kind of laws. It has a right to determine its own immigration policy. Why does the state of Israel as a government have authority? It has authority because it is elected by the people. If the majority of the people have been evicted, they can't elect that government because they're not there presently to give that government the authority that would later on decide who can go in and out of the borders. So the vast majority of Palestinians were evicted before they could be consulted or before they could elect that government, and therefore the government is illegitimate because it excluded them. It's like saying the apartheid South African government has the right to determine who is a citizen, who is not, because it is a government, and exclude the vast majority of the population from that consultation process that gives them legitimacy in the first place. So that's the ridiculousness of your argument, to say, well, it's legitimate to deny the right of return to Palestinians because it's a government that makes the laws. Well, it wasn't making the laws representing the majority of the people, and like the apartheid South African government, it was illegitimate to determine for the vast majority of people, their condition and whether they were citizens or not.
All right. So
There was something else.
Let me
So
address
the-
that, just so we can kind of have a fruitful discussion.
Yeah.
Also, it's sort of, I don't mind people clapping. That's obviously fine. They can clap where they want. But what I'd like to is be able to have a back and forth. So the clapping then means I don't get to speak because then you just ask the next question, then we don't have a discussion. All right.
Well, I wanted to respond to something else you had previously said. That's all. And then, as I said, I will let you speak uninterrupted. I just want to finish something else you said. So, yes, I will let him speak, but I haven't finished responding to something he previously mentioned. Because if he mentions multiple points, and I have to have a chance to respond to his multiple points, and then he will have a chance to respond to my multiple points.
Okay,
Sorry?
hold on. Sorry, sir.
All right, calm.
Sorry,
Let's
sir.
just-
Sorry, you start.
Yeah.
I just want to reiterate the rules, guys. Okay, I'm not sure if everybody was here when we started. I asked you to kindly respect that this is an intellectual debate between these two gentlemen. All right? If you have a question, if you have an opinion, we are going to have a Q&A after this debate. So I've asked you to please don't shout out. It's going to disturb their train of thought. We want to respect both gentlemen. We want to respect the audience. So allow them to finish. We've got about 25 minutes left. You will have your opportunity to share your question. Okay? Thank you.
So this will be the last point I mention about this before we go on to the more pertinent discussion of what happened after October the 7th and on October the 7th itself. So you mentioned previously a legal term that most of you probably didn't catch called uti possidentis juris. Possidentis juris. So most people aren't lawyers like yourself, so I'll just explain what it is. It's a customary law that states that when there's a former colonial territory, when the colonizer leaves it and gives it independence, you might have a minority group in that territory want to break away from that territory because they say, well, we want to be a separate nation. So the principle of possidentis juris is that the borders established by the colonizer be respected as long as the minority in that land is represented in government, right? Called internal self-determination. Have I discussed it correctly, more or less? Okay. And this was used against the province of Quebec when they wanted to secede from Canada. It was said, uti possidentis juris, they can't just succeed unilaterally. Canada has to let them go with consent, you could say, because you have to respect the colonial boundaries as is. So Israel argued this in the ICJ debate, you could say, on whether Gaza was occupied territory. And they argued it because they said, well, Gaza is not occupied territory or the West Bank because it kind of belongs to us. The original territory of Palestine was the whole mandate of Palestine, minus Jordan, of course. And so we have a right to all the land in Palestine, not just the partition. So it was argued why the court dismissed it, and this was, you might know this, maybe not, and this is something that you should know. Why they dismissed it is they said, even if we humor the argument that the whole of Palestine should remain as one continuous state, one full state, you cannot use this principle if you're the minority and you want to take over the state and deny the majority their right to self-determination. This was actually a principle to tell minorities not to leave the majority if they're minority, to say, I don't want to be under this majority, I'm going to separate. But the Israeli argument was on its head that they can have a right to all the territory and still exclude the majority. And that's why they rejected it. They said this is the very opposite of President Zionism. If you were to follow this principle, it is the Palestinians that should have one whole democratic state, equal rights for all, which is what the Palestinians have always argued, at least back then. So that is exactly why it's very disingenuous that Zionists argue this, because this principle was used to say that the majority should have the right to self-determination externally, as long as the minority have equal rights. But the only one that opposed a one-state solution with everyone equal rights, who was it? It wasn't the Palestinians. It was the Zionists from Ben Gurion till today. No one-state solution. They say that's a cultural genocide for us. This is the elimination of the Jewish state, exactly like the white South African National Party said when they didn't want to have a whole state for everybody equal rights. Is that not the case, sir?
Well, so if you read the judgment in these sort of South Africa ICJ cases over the war, you have a decision from the Ugandan judge where she makes it clear that Utipotsidinus Juris is an alive question on the topic. So I don't think it's a settled question, and I think there are arguments to be made on that front. All right, but to transition to the sort of, well, I want to just pick up on one thing you said, and then I'll transition to the topic of the day. The one is around the idea of, those citizens who are left unrepresented, and you want to say, well, they ought to be able to determine, the laws of the country which they don't reside in. But they do have government representatives. So, you have Hamas representing them for a while in Gaza, and then you have the PA in the West Bank. And of course, the difficulty you have with the PA is that, there hasn't been an election in the last 18 years, but they did vote them in. And so there's some level of sovereignty and control. You also have a situation where Hamas killed their political opponents in Gaza. So the idea that you could have one state that encompasses Gaza and the West Bank might be desirable, but I think it's impractical given the sort of hostilities between the two regimes. That may shift, in the peace process that occurs, and maybe you would be able to have one sort of unified state with land swaps and things like that. But I don't think practically that's been a viable solution for a while, and I think there isn't enough discussion about a three-state solution, given that you really do have different political beliefs. I mean, Fatah, secular, Hamas are not. The different kinds of norms they expect of their citizens are different. The values they have are different. The idea of a one-state solution as well. Here's a difficulty you have. The beliefs of those in Hamas are not coextensive with liberal democracy. So, for example, in Tel Aviv, you can be openly gay. You can choose to lead that life. I don't think you could do that in Gaza. I think you'd be executed. When you have fundamental differences between groups about how people should be treated, there is good reason not to put them under one state, that you're asking for bloodshed. The reason why you have a security barrier in the West Bank is because of a series of suicide attacks. You can go sit in a restaurant in Jerusalem now, and there'll be shrapnel on the walls because you had people who strapped bombs to their chests, blew themselves up, and deliberately targeted innocent civilians. Israelis don't like the fact that you have to have the security barrier. It's a blight on the landscape, but it is one of the things that's necessary because you have, a population group that has declared a violent war against civilians. And this brings us to the sort of topic of discussion today, which is one I think would be interesting to know. You mentioned you have the kind of radical claim that the Israelis have no right of self-defense. What do you think they should have done after October 7th? And do you think that the methods used by Hamas were justifiable?
Okay. So, no questions. I didn't interrupt him, you see, and let him speak. And so now I'm going to respond, hopefully uninterrupted as well, please. Right. So my interlocutor said that the Palestinians who were evicted and weren't even consulted on the initial election of the Israeli government at the beginning, it's okay because 60, 70 years later, they're represented by these smaller areas of their territory. I would say 22% of their original homeland, but it's actually less if you consider the West Bank is only about 40% under administrative semi-autonomy, if you can call it that. So you say it's okay because they're represented by these much smaller areas where they are kind of corralled into, and that's sufficient to represent them, not by the state that they lived in, the state that will be created in the land they lived in and the towns that they lived in. The reason why I really wanted this to have a debate with the Zionists in South Africa is because you South Africans know exactly where we've heard this before. It's called Bantustans, right? The South African government said, we're not an apartheid, a real apartheid government in terms of separating by race, because we give the races, each race, their own area, which is a sovereign state in itself that no one else recognizes, apart from one country that recognized it. Do you know which country had a de facto recognition, diplomatic relations with these fake Bantustans? Have a guess, everybody. Israel. Because birds of a feather flock together. They got each other's back. Anyway, so the whole argument sounds like a Bantustan justification, which I think is completely bogus. As for the argument that, well, how can we have a one state with people that want to kill us or suicide bombers or so on and so forth? I want to quote you from a book. It's a very good book. I'm going to be promoting it. And no, he didn't pay me to do this. This is a great author, Peter Beinart. He's a South African. He's a Jewish South African. So he's from here, from Cape Town, actually. And he wrote, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. It's a very wonderful book. I would like to read you a piece which I think answers your question. So he says, consider the fate of a South African practice called the necklace. It was the ANC's method for punishing collaborators with the apartheid regime. Comrades would hang a tie around the unfortunate's neck, douse it with gasoline, set it on fire. In 1985, Nelson Mandela's wife, Winnie, one of the Black South Africa's most powerful figures, declared, with our boxes of matches and our necklaces, we will liberate this country. The ANC would not condemn the practice. White South Africans shuddered as they imagined handing over the country to such people. But once a non-violent way of ending apartheid appeared as an alternative, notes political scientist Mahmoud Mandani, hardly anyone could be found to champion the necklacing the day after. The necklace was a brutal response to a brutal system. Once that system disappeared, it did too. So you condemn suicide bombing, and even though Hamas renounced it, but the problem is that suicide bombing, targeting Israelis, was a symptom of a disease. And that disease was the brutal oppression, occupation of the Palestinian people. That's where what arose it. As the poem says, to whom evil is done, they do evil in return. And that's the unfortunate situation. It's unfortunate.
Just a question.
It's unfortunate. But now to answer your third question that you posed to me, which is, what do you think Israel should have done on the events of October the 7th? Now, I think we should have a discussion as to what Hamas has said their intentions were, what they wanted it to do, because you actually argue, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it's not Israel committing the genocide in Gaza, but it was Hamas who was doing the genocide on October the 7th. I think is that what you argue? I misrepresented you on that.
No, I think that's accurate. Yeah.
Okay. So this is what he argues. So we should discuss the intent. So I want to go back to and this is a comparison that Israel made, Hamas and ISIS. So when ISIS targets civilians, which they do, and most of them Muslim, they don't say, oh, no, we never meant to target civilians. They proudly say, and they justify it with fake, pseudo Islamic sounding arguments. They argue, because they have to tell their soldiers why it's not forbidden in Islam, even though all Muslims know it is, but why there's an exception in this day and age to targeting civilians, the prohibition of targeting civilians. But the strange thing I noticed was Hamas's official position is that they did not order their soldiers to target civilians. There was an Israeli Jewish lady that came on Israeli TV. She said that those 2 Hamas fighters came into her house, and she was worried. And apparently they said, "Don't worry, we're Muslims," and then asked permission to have some bananas that she had on the table. And she said, "Yeah, sure, have some bananas." And also, enter into evidence exhibit C, you could say. Israel released interviews of captured Hamas fighters. And they said to these individuals, don't you believe that it is wrong to target civilians? And they say, yes, we were told and taught in our madrasas, in our Islamic schools and so on, that it is wrong to target civilians, to kill civilians. But who controls the madrasas of Gaza? It's Hamas. So I was curious, it doesn't seem to fit the Israeli narrative, because Hamas outwardly have denied in a document saying our narrative that they told their soldiers to target civilians. Their soldiers acknowledge that Islam, or say that Islam tells them they're not allowed to target civilians. So that's the understanding of Islam there. And then reports by Israeli Jews that met Hamas fighters and came to their house and so on, saying that don't worry, I'm Muslim. It doesn't seem to fit the Israeli narrative. Hamas wanted to go in and their objective was to kill as many civilians as is possible. It just doesn't seem to fit, right? So all we have to go on the intention of Hamas or intent of Hamas is your say so and the Israeli government say so. The same Israeli government that would say things like, oh, there was these ambulances coming to us. Oh, we didn't know they were ambulances. They were suspected vehicles. We shot and destroyed them. They were coming, they had their lights switched off, and then a camera footage was released from a mobile phone on the dead body of the one Palestinian survivor. Well, it wasn't survivor, but first aider, which showed they had their light blaring and everything. And then people said, this Israeli government lies. I know it's a radical thing to say, but the Israeli government actually lies, much like the South African government lied about Soweto, much like the Nazis lied, but they were killing Jews up until the time it was discovered by pictures. So why should I take the Israeli government's narrative, which you seem to drunk full on, and go against evidence that seems to suggest that Hamas had other motives other than just killing every Jew they could find?
Gentlemen, we have 10 minutes left of our dialogue, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Not necessary, sir. Not necessary.
So I don't have to rely on the Israeli narrative. I think what you can do is rely on the footage filmed by Hamas on October 7th. So there's an infamous phone call of a son calling up his parents, and he says, I've killed 10 Jews, and I'm calling you from one of their phones. And he's jubilant about killing Jews. If you look at the sort of footage that comes out, it's quite evident that civilians are targeted. I've actually been to those massacre sites. So if you go to Near Oz and you go to the Nova Festival, I mean, it is evident that the people that were killed are not military targets. They are civilians. People that you had at Nova Festival were dancing. And I've been to the spots where they were executed, where they hid in bomb shelters and then were killed with grenades, where people were sort of gunned down while hiding in trees. I've been to the homes of those that were burnt down. So people who sort of managed to survive by hiding in a safe room and the rest of the house would be burnt down. Those were clearly targeted at civilians. I mean, the idea that it's a lie is kind of incredible, given that you have these handovers by Hamas of civilians, including of the corpses of the Bibas twins, so young babies, and the autopsies on them show that they were strangled to death. So the idea that Hamas respects civilian life and would never do these terrible things just seems extraordinary to me. also in conjunction with your claim that, well, suicide bombing is fine because in South Africa they used necklaces. I wonder if you know who the necklaces were used against. You know, I think you've been in South Africa for a short period of time. Do you know who were necklaced? Just tell me who you think were being burned
I
alive.
quoted him. He said collaborators. It was against collaborators.
Yeah, so you had lots of poor black children who were burnt to death.
But then Winnie Mandela said that we'll liberate South Africa with necklaces, which,
Yeah,
if you
it's-
want to interpret it in one way, could mean everyone, all their enemies get necklaced, quote unquote. But that wasn't actually what happened. That wasn't actually their intent. But okay,
I mean, during
let's get back
during
to
the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I mean, I don't think there are many South Africans who celebrate the use of necklaces. It's interesting to me that you would see that as a wonderful thing that the South Africans did to liberate themselves and use it as a justification. I mean, I'm sure there are, people in this room who are sympathetic to what you've said, but I don't know how many are sympathetic to the idea of children being burnt alive with rubber tires and gasoline. It's a dreadful period of South African history. But again, the claim seems to be, well, if those sorts of things are justifiable, killing kids with tires, well, then obviously all the stuff in Hamas is also justifiable. But you also want to do a denial game where you claim, no, Hamas, despite the footage, despite all the evidence, despite the hostages' bodies, none of that stuff really happened. You know, in your opening statement.
No, I didn't. Did I say none of that stuff ever happened? Did I deny any of video evidence? I'm simply saying that we're discussing intent, and when you look at genocide, you have to look at intent.
Yep.
So there are two things I want to mention, but I have to kind of give you evidence because I don't want to just make claims. So if you give me just some of your time, I will give you some evidences. So let's look at. So I don't deny there were houses blown, there were houses burnt down. I also don't deny that we all saw videos of an Israeli tank shooting into a house and blowing it up in an Israeli kibbutz. We also know about the Hannibal Directive, which shot Hellfire missiles and a lot of burned bodies of Jews in the Gaza envelope area were burnt, suggesting of Hellfire missiles being used against them. So that also is the case. And the Hannibal Directive was admitted by a defense minister that was used. It was ordered on the day of October 7th or after. So this is all a matter of fact. But the question is, does the killing of civilians, which occurs in war, and I've heard you say war is hell before, I wonder if you'd say I wonder if Hamas could use your line and say, well, we didn't intend it because war is hell. But let's look at, I suppose, intent, I suppose, is the most important thing. So he cites these examples of dead people who were killed and so on and so forth. We heard 40 dead beheaded babies, and then that turned out to be a complete lie. That was the official claim of the Israeli state, which, surprise, surprise, wasn't actually true. But let's look at what when Israel bombed Gaza after October 7th, or on October 7th, we see, for example, the al-Andalusi family, 15 members killed, 7 children, in a strike that hit a 3-story residential building. Amnesty International investigated whether there was any military targets there, any Hamas fighters. Anyone asked the Israeli government, who were you targeting? No one. No evidence of any Hamas there. The Hijazi family killed 10th of October by an Israeli strike. 12 members of their family killed, 4 neighbors killed. Israel claimed we're targeting Hamas, but no evidence, both on the ground or by Israel, of who they were targeting or any Hamas fighters there at all. The Harb family, 25 civilians killed, including 10 children. Imagine the children in your house, 10 of them, 10 of your family, your cousins or their children, but not all of them being wiped out. Again, study showed that there was no military objectives in the vicinity, no Hamas activity at all there. And of course, Israel hasn't explained it. The Zaroub family killed the 19th of December, this is all again 2023. 22 civilians killed, 11 children. Strike hit the family home. Investigators found no evidence of military targets. The Nofal family, 18 civilians killed, including 10 children. The strike hit the 5th floor of the family building. No evidence. Now, this is Amnesty International. Associated Press did its own investigations where it could. The Salam family, and here is 270 members of their family killed across multiple strikes. The Associated Press analysis of the strikes found no evidence of military targets anywhere in their vicinity. Al-Mughrabi family, 17 members. Okay.
5 minutes left, gentlemen.
So my point is this. There just recently 2 videos came out of Israeli soldiers. Let me finish. Israeli soldiers summarily executing people who had their hands up, just shooting at soldiers. And for him, this is not evidence of genocide. This is just bad apples. This is just, the odd criminal activity, even though there's systematic airstrikes, even though Biden approached Benjamin Netanyahu and said, why are you carpet bombing Gaza? And he says, well, this is we have to use these tactics against these people. So when on the day of October the 7th, according to a report of a meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu, he was told, how many targets do we have to strike? And he said, we only had about 1,000 or so Hamas targets. Only 1,000? Why not 5,000? Why not more? Right? He didn't care about Hamas targets. He cared about vengeance, and he cared about eventually what he would publicly say, the eviction of the Palestinians from Gaza by killing a portion of them, which fulfills the criteria for genocide. So why is that not genocide to you, but a few video cameras that of people committing war crimes is evidence of genocide to you?
Okay. So as I sort of said at the beginning, you have to have data specialis. So it must be that the only inference that you can draw from the act of killing is one of annihilation of the group in whole or in part. And I think you have that in the case of the Hamas attacks. So because you have this deliberate targeting of civilians, I don't think that if you didn't have that if you didn't have the Israeli army repel that attack, the plan was for those guys to sort of get into Tel Aviv and to try and kill as many people as possible. So you have a mass impact claim. I mean, the one way of describing it is really as an invasion. The vast numbers of people who came over to destroy things in a rampant, brutal way. On the other hand, what you have with Israelis, I mean, you can mention situations, there might very well be instances where you say, look, this breaches the laws of war. That's a very separate question from genocide. So genocide, you must ask, is there data specialis? Is there the intention to wipe out the Palestinian people? And that's the only inference we can draw. To say, well, these civilians were killed and this particular attack is not justifiable, we can't find a proportionality. That may very well be the case in a particular strike. But that doesn't get you to the genocide case. What you have to be able to do to show that there's genocide would be to say that there's no other reason why the war continues. You have to try and explain why, after the hostages are returned, that you don't have this continual bombing. You don't have, the wiping out of all people, despite the fact that the Israelis have the capacity to do it. You don't have a situation where there's an ethnic cleansing that's going on, because the idea is to build a new state in that territory, with the various stages that are sort of set in the peace plan. And the idea is to sort of have a peaceful transition from the Hamas leadership, asking them to put down their weapons, giving them safe passage. You have a compromise from the Israelis because, as I say, the two war objectives were to release the hostages and the utter destruction of Hamas, and they haven't achieved the second war objective. And they could have achieved it by killing everybody, and they didn't. And as I say, you haven't explained why they provided warnings to civilians. The other thing that you've got to ask as well, when we're comparing wars, one way to get a sense of is this disproportionate is to look at the civilian military casualty ratios. And so what you have in the Gaza conflict is about a 2-to-1 ratio. So every 2 civilians that are killed, roughly 1 militant is killed. Under conditions where you have a very dense population and you have hostages who are kept in civilian buildings. So a lot of hostages have testified that they were held captive by ordinary civilians. And then you have this tunnel infrastructure that is sort of underneath civilian infrastructure. Ordinarily, it would be unlawful to target a mosque or a hospital or a school. But as soon as those areas become used by militants, then the laws of war allow you to treat them as military targets. And so you have this terrible situation where you have innocent civilians in Gaza who are held captive by Hamas, who are using them as human shields, who have hoarded foods to, sort themselves out and sort of allow Palestinians to, to suffer. And many Palestinians have really suffered under the yoke of this totalitarian, sinister regime. What's interesting is that you've had some flights of Gazans coming to South Africa.
Okay, gentlemen, unfortunately, we've reached our hour. Thank you very, very much.
He was asking me some questions, and
Yep, we're gonna allow that just now.
How will I be able to answer those questions he posed to me?
So would you like to continue with the Q&A? Would you like to take a break?
If you just give me 3 minutes and then we
Okay.
can go to
Can I
Q&A.
allow 3 minutes on your side and 3 minutes on your side? Is that okay? Okay, thank you.
Questions. Okay, so he said, Dole Specialis, you need to improve intent. So I will ask him a challenge. Where did Hamas officially say, we did this to commit to kill Jews, we want to kill as many Jews as possible? Ghazi Hamad, the interview he quoted, the infamous one where a guy said, we will do this again and again, and he gave a reason until the people he was talking about to end the occupation. He said in that exact same interview that, no, we didn't target civilians. We didn't intend or command to target civilians. So why do you believe him on one part of what he said and you quote it, but you don't believe the other part of what he said in the same interview? Right, that's the question you need to ask yourself. We all need to ask you, actually. Okay, he said a civilian ratio. This is very interesting, and there's a lot of things he said. I can't deal with it all, but he said, and by the way, I want to get to quotes of what the Israeli government actually said, including saying there's no innocent civilians in Gaza. So much so that even the Israeli soldiers were on video, masses of them dancing and saying, our motto is, there are no innocents in Gaza. Anyway, but the point I was civilian ratio. So he says the civilians to soldier or fighter ratio is 2 to 1. So 2 civilians dead to 1, and that's acceptable. That's not a genocide. But you know what's interesting? Why not apply that ratio consistently? Of the 1,150 or so, depending on different statistics of Israelis that died on October 7th, 1/3 of them were security forces and soldiers and so on, were they not? This means that the ratio of soldiers to civilians is 2 to 1 as well. So why is it that 2 to 1 means it's not genocide unless it's the Palestinians doing it, and then that is genocide. Exact same ratio is genocide. You need to answer that. And of course, that's also false because as released recently, classified data from an IDF database was leaked. It named basically that the civilian death ratio was 83% of the people that were killed. That's 4 to 1 in Gaza. And just so you know, the Srebrenica genocide that occurred in Bosnia, which is considered to be a genocide, was basically 90% of civilians to 10% soldiers. So this is 83% civilians to 17% soldiers. It's very close to genocidal levels. Right? So why don't we talk about those statistics? Because those statistics, if you want to go to civilian ratio, it argues against yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Brother Abdullah. Mark?
Let me respond to that. So one is one of the principles is that you can't intentionally target civilians, and then the ratios are when you are targeting a military target and you know that there will be casualties. So there's a difference, in other words, when you deliberately target people dancing at a festival and people living in a civilian village versus if you're attacking military targets who have surrounded themselves by civilians. So there's a huge difference between those two things, and that's why you can draw the distinction. If you look at the war in Yugoslavia, when NATO forces were fighting against the Serbian army, the ratio there was 4 to 1. In Mosul, I think you had about 3 to 4 to 1. So those sort of casualty ratios are not described as genocidal. They're just the kind of casualties that you have in wars. But again, you have to look at the particular context of it. So when you have many of those civilians who are killed because of the way that Hamas has treated them, that changes the numbers. You've got to look at a sort of moral responsibility. So for example, if you have a group of bank robbers who go into a bank and they hold people hostage, and then the police come in, and during the shootout, the police kill some of those hostages, they're not morally liable for it. The reason why those hostages are there is because of the bank robbers. And so one of the reasons why you have, civilians dying in Gaza is because of Hamas holding them hostage, not referring to the Israelis they held hostage, referring to the Gazans they held hostage. So that's one of the reasons why you have this unfortunate situation. But again, you haven't addressed, in other words, the fundamental claim is that Dole Specialis requires that there is no other possible thing that you could determine from the activity. And it feels like there are two very good things that the Israelis have said: release the hostages, which they've managed to do through military pressure, and weaken Hamas, which they haven't done sufficiently but have done a large job of. And that the fact that they didn't persist in the mass killing of civilians, the argument must be that you haven't met the Dole Specialis requirement. I think it's highly unlikely that South Africa will succeed in that case. So much so that Nabi Pillay said that the only way that the South Africans could achieve victory in that case would be to change the rules. And so you have, parties who've joined that litigation, like Ireland, who've said, well, you should change the rules. But on the current standards, it's not possible. It doesn't meet the requirements of a genocide. And I'm willing to bet anyone they want, with any money you have, I'll give you 2-to-1 odds that the South Africans lose that case at the ICJ. And put on any amount of cash. I just think it's highly unlikely it'll be found that way because it doesn't meet the requirements.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Would you like to take a break, or are you open to do a bit of Q&A right now?
We can open for some Q&A.
Yeah.
Are you okay with that? Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, please give our panelists a round of applause. They've given off their time, they've given off their effort to come through and have this discussion. If I can have somebody from IPCI to assist with people that would like to come up and ask questions. So how are we going to do the Q&A for now? If we can keep our questions to 30 seconds. I know it's difficult, but if we can, because of time constraints, 30 seconds. And if you can tell me who you'd like to answer that question, we will give our panelists 3 minutes to answer the question, and we would give the other panelists 1.5 minutes to add any comments of their own. Are we okay with that? Okay. If you'd like to come through, we have a mic in front. Please come through. Brother Ismail will direct you and assist with any Q&A or any questions that you have. Thank you so much. Okay, sister, remember, 30 seconds. We're here to be polite. We're here to be calm. And we'd like our brothers to answer.
Good evening. Israel is not only committing genocide since 7th October, but since the 1948 Nakba. If we can count how many Palestinians have been killed since the 1948 Nakba until now, right now, they're probably in the millions. Is that not correct?
Okay, thank you, sister. Mark, is that directed at Mark?
1948 until now, how many Palestinians have the Zionists killed in Israel?
All right, thank you very much. Mark, if you could direct your answer to the sister.
If you can show me any evidence of millions of Palestinians being killed, I'm all ears. I don't think anyone credible makes a claim like that. We know that Yasser Arafat claimed that 30,000 Palestinians were killed by the Jordanians Black September, and that was the sort of previous high watermark. You do have the displacement, but that's not the same as killing. One of the things that I think is important is that we've had an inflation around certain concepts. And I think it's important that when we use a term like genocide, that it's an accurate term, that it's meant to be the sort of crime of all crimes, that it's going to be an incredibly rare thing. It's obviously it's the most undesirable thing, but we shouldn't describe things that we dislike as genocide. You may want to sort of be critical of the Israeli state for various things, but the idea that there's been an ongoing genocide for 76 years just seems to stretch the term in a way that may very well undermine the cause. If everything amounts to a genocide, then nothing amounts to a genocide. So, as I said, if you look at the population size since 48 to now, the Palestinian group has enlarged in size. I don't imagine that my interlocutor will accept the claim that millions of Palestinians have been killed.
All right. Thank you very much, Mark.
Yeah.
Start, Abdullah, you have an opportunity to respond.
Yeah. Genocides don't depend on whether people want to kill every single one. It's not defined as you kill everyone from that ethnic group, right? Because in whole or in part, that's the definition. You can also kill half of the ethnic group for a particular reason. So, for example, Ben-Gurion didn't want 40% of the new state called Israel to be Palestinian Arabs. So afterwards, only 20% remained. See, there's a motivation. And when you talked about motivation, no other possible motive, and Mosul as well. Firstly, you said Mosul, it was 4 civilians to every soldier. Not so. The vast majority of reports say it was a 1-to-1. So 1 soldier was died to every civilian died in Mosul. So that doesn't work. But 4-to-1 still remains. And I think the last one is no other possible motivation, you said. Hamas have officially said that their motivation is they wanted hostages to release all the Palestinian political prisoners, or at least most of the Palestinian political prisoners. So by his criteria, if there's an alternative explanation, then you can't say it's a genocide. But if you'd allow me, I'll just quote Benjamin Netanyahu to you, who is someone of some authority in the Israeli government, perhaps. Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi talked about his meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu on October the 7th to discuss what they're going to do. So here's the exact quotation. So he said, what targets do we have to bomb? So he said, we only have 1,500 targets. He said, why not 5,000? Then Halevi said, we don't have 5,000 approved targets. Then Benjamin Netanyahu said, I'm not interested in targets. Take down houses, bomb with everything you have. Sounds pretty genocidal to me. Does it not?
All right. Thanks so much. We have another question. Remember to please keep it to 30 seconds. And if you can kindly tell me who you would like your question directed to.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to address a question to you, Abdullah. And what's always shocked me about this war is how Hamas have used consistently, and I think it's fine, used civilian hospitals, mosques, schools, and they've used human shields to protect their own soldiers and their command centers. And I understand that that's of war. And can you comment on that? Because I haven't heard you say anything that condemns that. I think it's absolutely atrocious, and it just shows the heart
Thank you, sir.
of the Hamas people. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Brother Abdullah, I think that question was directed at you.
Oh, yes, the old human shields argument. It didn't start. Israel have been using this for decades in Lebanon, in Syria, and so everywhere they say, and in Jordan, where they first started destroying villages and towns in the 50s and 60s. Back then they didn't say human shields, they just said reprisals. But anyway, so human shields. The argument was, I quoted multiple studies of bombing targets, people that were bombed and destroyed, because Israel officially said these are Hamas targets. And the investigation on the ground yielded no Hamas targets. We have to ask ourselves the question, you see, Israel is probably getting pretty bad PR at the moment, and it would behove them perhaps to get as many journalists into Gaza as possible who want to go, to verify that there's Hamas everywhere, and Hamas arms on every single street corner and every single house, or every other house, according to one Israeli minister, every other house in the entire strip. Like Hamas has a military structure more than most nation-state regimes. But Israel doesn't want independent journalists there, and it banned them. It's banned to now. You can't enter Gaza if you, as a journalist. So the issue of human shields, well, look at Shifa Hospital. Do you remember seeing that kind of computer animated graphic, right? Of it, like it was like multiple levels and like this deep underground layer, like a Bond movie villains underground layer, but underneath Shifa Hospital. And then when they actually went in there and people asked, where's this underground layer? They just took a picture of some AK-47s behind an MRI machine. But there you go. And they use it as a pretext to attack and bomb that hospital. This is why we don't believe Israel when it claims human shields. We've heard it from their mouths when they say, one general said, we don't care about precision, but we're more for destruction or damage, or we're going for maximum damage. But there is people in this conflict, or you could say more like a regime in this conflict, that does use human shields. I want to refer you to the Allon Plan. Please research it for yourself. The Allon Plan was what to do about the West Bank when Israel had initially conquered it. So they said, you know what, we need to build civilian settlements to become the first line of defense against Jordan, or in the Gaza envelope as well, to go around Gaza. The civilian settlements would be a basis for defense, a first line of defense. What do you call someone that uses civilian settlements for strategic military defense in zones which were initially declared to be military zone? They said this is a military zone, and now we can build a settlement in here. What do you call that? You call that human shields. Your government, or maybe not your government, but the government that you are advocating for, they're the true people that use human shields, not to mention Palestinians they use as human shields when they throw them down alleyways to get shot.
Thank you. Mark, would you like to respond?
Yeah, so I think, again, we're about language beyond its bounds. Different. We're settled areas of present. There's a huge difference. There's also just a difference in terms of view on life between the two groups. So the Israelis take the view that all lives are sacred, including Palestinian lives, that every innocent life that is lost is regrettable, and that they are willing to engage in these vastly disproportionate exchanges of hostages for prisoners. So you've had thousands of Palestinian prisoners sent there, including Sinwar. So Sinwar, one of the masterminds of October 7th, who was in an Israeli prison, was diagnosed with brain cancer while he was
30
there,
seconds.
and his life was saved by an Israeli doctor. And the idea that the Israelis take life so seriously that they're willing to save the lives of those that pose the greatest threat to them is very different from the death cult of Hamas.
Sir, Jewish Zionists and Christian Zionists often, as you've done, want to babble about the intent and possibility of whether it occurred regarding ethnic cleansing and genocide. Sir, a liar. Have you never seen footage, photos and live footage of what Gaza looks like? You've never seen hundreds of hospitals razed to the ground, churches, mosques, buildings, 5-story, up to 10-story buildings flattened. You've never seen that? We've got a simple saying in English. The taste of the pudding, something like this, is in the eating. I think you saw the photos and I think you saw the footage, but you turned away and denied that it happened.
Thank you, sir. Mark, if I can ask you to respond.
Sure. So, no, I'm not in the game of denying the damage done to Gaza. There's clear footage of the destruction to the infrastructure, and it's incredibly tragic. As I've said, one of the reasons why you have that is, firstly, the intractable stance from Hamas. So you wouldn't have had that destruction if Hamas handed back the hostages and put down its weapons.
Yeah.
So you've had this enormous attack on...
All right.
No, I
Sorry,
answered the
sir.
question.
If we can just we just allow Mark to respond. Okay. All right.
No,
Okay.
so I
Thank
answered
you,
the
sir.
question.
Okay.
So what I've said is that I don't deny that there's been enormous destruction in Gaza. The question is, who's responsible for it? And the people, obviously, like there's, well, we've said 70,000 people. And so the question is why and who's responsible? And so 20,000 of them we've said are probably militants. And then the others are civilians. And it's tragic the civilians have lost their lives. And I say the reason why that a lot of them lost their lives is because, Hamas surrounded them with that. So you are right to be enraged at the loss of civilian life, but you should target your ire at the true genitors of that suffering, which is, the terrorist group Hamas.
All right. Thank you. Start if you'd like to respond.
Okay. I'm very disappointed in Mark. He's insulting our intelligence. He spoke about visiting the sites of the Hamas attacks, seeing some destruction and saying, this proves genocide. But 80% of Gaza's flattened. Oh, that's not a genocide. That's just war is hell. Oh, well. You should be ashamed, sir. And Israel never said that they're going to stop the war when you give back the hostages. Hamas offered them the ceasefire agreement, and it was actually, they formed the ceasefire agreement in January 2024. and it was releasing half the hostages by that point in time. And if they'd continued it, the rest would have gone, presumably. But no, who restarted the war? It was Israel, because Israel said, we want the destruction of Hamas. And as they've also said, we want the Palestinians to voluntarily go to another place. And of course, to help them voluntarily make that free will choice, we're going to blockade everything, food, water, clothing, everything from entering that place, including baby formula, so they can make a voluntary choice. So please, sir, you can say anything you want to us, but please
20
don't
seconds.
insult our intelligence.
All right. Young man, if you
Yeah.
could ask you a question.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask Abdullah a question. You talked about the so-called intent of the Hamas people on October the 7th to not target civilians, which I don't believe for a second. But is it true that in the Quran, in wanting to have Sharia law as the kind of apex of your global caliphate type
Thank you, sir.
goal, is it true that the killing of all Jews throughout the world is called for? Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, could you repeat the last bit? I didn't hear
If
it.
you could just repeat your last part.
Is it true that the killing of all Jews throughout the world is called for in the Quran?
I tell you
Stop.
what, if you find the Quran, any verse of the Quran saying the killing of all Jews, I'll give you £50,000 or 100,000 rand if you'd like, right? Because that is a slur and a lie against the Quran, and it's no different to the, these you used to hear in World War II, the Nazi slurs saying that Jews want to dominate the world. It's in their Talmud. Oh, any reference? Trust me, bro. So I tell you what, quote me the verse, quote us the verse before you make such accusations. But I'll tell you this. If your claim is that Muslims are somehow compelled or wanting to kill all the Jews around the world, was there almost 1 million Jews or more than 1 million Jews in the Muslim world protected by us, sought refuge with us, to the point that Theodor Herzl, the father of political Zionism, said that he praised the Middle East, praised the Ottoman Caliphate, and said, you've always been kind to the Jews. That it's a natural place for Jews to go to. Why would you just want to go to a place where people want to kill all of them? Because they don't.
Thank you. Mark, would you like to respond?
Yeah, so I suppose the passage that often gets cited on this, which is mentioned in the Hamas Charter, is that the rocks and the trees will cry out that there is a Jew hiding behind them and that you should kill them. And so someone might draw the inference that the text doesn't think that Jews are just like everybody else and are deserving of protection, when even Mother Nature itself says, kill these people. So there's a reason why I said what he said.
So, okay. All right. So if we can have our next question.
Hi, so my question is for Mark. Mark, you said earlier that for genocide to be plausible, there needs to be the intent and the underlying acts for the genocide, right? But Mr. Andalusi has asked you many times that the Israeli government themselves, Netanyahu, and you keep dodging it, they themselves, referring to the Palestinians as Amalek, they themselves have referred to attacking, they themselves have expressed the intent to kill the Palestinians. And then they've gone on a bombing campaign for years. So how have they not intended to kill everyone? Because they themselves say they're going to kill everyone.
Time.
And they themselves have bombed everyone. So how can you still say that there's not a genocide happening in Gaza?
Okay, Mark, your 3 minutes to respond. You can move a little closer to the mic.
Sure. All right, you guys can hear me. So the Israeli government has been quite clear about drawing a distinction between Palestinians and Hamas. You have had, just after October 7th, eruptions of anger after what happened. And so, it's not unexpected that people would say things that are impulsive or, look like they're sort of upset with everybody. But it's quite clear that the mandate of the state has not been to target civilians, it's been to target Hamas. I mean, as my interlocutor has said, that there are two objectives: rescue the hostages and eradicate Hamas. If the directive was genocidal, it would be eradicate all Palestinians, which would be what's required. So if you look at what the Genocide Convention says, it's not that there's no prohibition on trying to eradicate a military group or a terrorist group. It's in eradicating an ethnic group or religious group. So if you targeted Palestinians qua Palestinians, that of course would be prohibited, but targeting Hamas as that group is not prohibited. So there's a distinction to be drawn, and the state has drawn it. You might have some individuals, maybe there's examples of soldiers saying things, songs being sung, but it's not the policy of the state. And in order to have genocide met, it has to be a state policy. It can't be that some loudmouth sort of says, well, you should kill everybody. That's not sufficient.
Thank you. So,
Right.
if you'd like to respond?
Chair of the Israeli government's Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, Boaz Bismuth, we must not forget that there are no quote-unquote innocent civilians. He put the quotes there. And he says, there is no place for any humanitarian gesture. The memory of Amalek must be erased. Benjamin Netanyahu then uses it twice. You must not forget what Amalek did to you twice. President Isaac Herzog said, it's an entire nation out there that's irresponsible. It's not true that this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true. So how did Israelis understand these rhetoric about Bezalel Smotrich? There are 2 million Nazis in Gaza. Yoav Gallant, defense minister, he said, we're imposing a complete siege on Gaza. That's everyone. No electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. We're fighting human animals and we're acting accordingly. So you're targeting all of them. And he's saying the reason why we're targeting all of them is because they are human animals. He said, Gaza, we're going to release all restraints. Gaza won't return to what it was before. We will eliminate everything. If they tell you your intent, why don't you believe them, Mark? Why don't you believe them when they say expressly their intent? Quite genocidal to me.
Thank you so much. Can we have our next question?
Hi, Mark. Hi. This is sort of an open question where both have a response. It's a similar to how we've been doing questions. It's an open one where both of them do have a response. It's not directed to anyone, but you'll get it. I'll try to be quick. Okay, so you both have great experience in your respective fields. I would like to know, with the knowledge that you have and the differing interpretations on the conflict, what would you like to see happen over the next few decades, assuming the relevant parties all comply, like the United Nations, the ICJ, the Israeli government, Hamas? What's the ideal vision for the region? And please try to respond with concrete policies or plans of actions and avoid PR answers or political rallies. What would you like to be done?
All right. So he hasn't directed it at anyone. Can I allow 2 minutes and 2 minutes for each to answer? All right. Can I start with you, Ustad?
Okay, so you say, well, what do people want to see happen? So I can only talk about the facts as they are. Benjamin Netanyahu and others have constantly talked about removing the Palestinians voluntarily from Gaza, and while destroying their water infrastructure, while not allowing medical aid to go in, while there are people on a major calorie deficit, i.e. starvation and famine, according to multiple UN reports, as well as Amnesty International. So they've stated what they want to see happen. Now, he cites Hamas charter. Hamas uses a hadith from the Prophet Muhammad, talking about a future time where there'll be a battle between a certain group of Muslims and a certain group of Jews. So they say that we see that our fight with Israel might encounter this, but it doesn't say all Jews will be killed and all Muslims will do the killing. It talks about a future battle somewhere, we don't know where. What it does say in the 1988 Hamas charter, they declare what they want to see happen. So I can only tell you what they say they want to see happen. They say they want to see Palestine under the wing of Islam, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews live peacefully. I'm paraphrasing, but they say Muslims, Christians, and Jews. If they want to kill all Jews, why is it that their stated intent is that Muslims, Christians, and Jews live in Palestine peacefully? That doesn't make any sense. And of course, because there was confusion, presumably they upgraded their constitution to 2017, where they said explicitly, we're not fighting Jews because they're Jews. We're fighting Zionists because they're occupying the land. And once they end the occupation, then the fighting ends. That's what their stated intent is. So presumably, if the occupation of Palestinians ends, then Hamas appears to say they will stop fighting. So I can only speculate as to, based on their stated intent.
Thank you. Mark?
So I assume that the time goes after the clapping finishes. Okay, so I assume you actually were asking both of us what we would like. And I think what you'd ideally like is, firstly, for Hamas to be totally dismantled in the region. I think you then need a denazification project. So I think you have a populace that's been brainwashed and fed all sorts of lies about Jews and Zionists. If you sort of look at school textbooks, you see lots of that kind of thing. You had a similar denazification project in Germany, right? So, how do you have a population that was, living under the Nazi regime that then becomes, one of the most peace-loving nations in Europe, returns to its erudite status? You have to have, a rebuilding that goes on. You have to have, education that goes on. And so I think the idea of being able to first ensure that your populace is peace-loving and actually does want to, live in this sort of utopic society where people respect each other as equals, if that is what is desired, then you should take steps to ensure that that occurs. I think you cannot have genuine statehood until you have those things in place. Now, Israel is in the game of trying to ensure peace with its neighbors and was busy doing that quite successfully before October 7th. And one of the reasons why, Hamas launches that attack is to derail the peace process. It doesn't
30
like
seconds.
the idea of the Israelis being friends with the Saudi Arabians and the Jordanians and, the Bahrainians. That the entire Arab world has sort of called on Hamas to dismantle itself and recognizes that that terrorist movement, has no place in the region if you care about the Palestinians.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we have our next question, please?
Hey, Mark. I just noticed something you mentioned that I thought was a little disingenuous when you mentioned Iraqi views. That kind of ignores the fact that there were social implications to living in Iraq during this time, as well as that there were Zionist militias that actively bombed synagogues in Iraq to make Iraqi Jews feel unsafe within their own country. My actual question is, my cousin has, and my little cousins have Jewish and Ashkenazi ancestry, while one of my best friends' grandma was literally kicked out of their house in Palestine. Why is it that my little cousins, whose grandparents have never been to Israel, are technically allowed to just claim citizenship, while my friend was never allowed to even visit?
Mark, over to you.
Yes. So if you think about the rules of citizenship that the Israeli government sets up, it's to say that if you were Jewish enough to be killed by the Nazis, which is basically 1/16 Jewish, then you are Jewish enough to start a new life here. If you think about how Israel starts, you really have swamp and desert. I mean, this is not desirable territory. You had many people who were professors and doctors who became bricklayers and farmers. And the idea was that it's important to have this safe haven for a people that have, suffered thousands of years of persecution. So that's one of the reasons why the state has that rule. As I say, with regards to the Palestinians, there's no state for Palestine that sets up such a right of return. And of course, there's good reason to think that it would destabilize the only Jewish state on the planet to allow a right of return, because you have people who are hostile to the values enunciated by the Israelis. And there are many, many, many states in that region. If you want to lead a flourishing life under Sharia law, you can have your pick of states. The idea that the Jews don't deserve one speck on this planet just strikes me as insane. If you think about the Christians that lived in Bethlehem, it was an 80% Christian city. They've been ethnically cleansed out of Bethlehem. I've brought this up on many occasions. Islamic states are not tolerant of other groups practically now. We do not have Christians leading flourishing lives in Syria, in Iran, even in Egypt. There are about 50 Jews who live in Egypt. So,
Okay.
All
Okay.
right.
Can we just keep that down to a minimum, please?
So it seems that the sort of opposition to the state of Israel is the idea that Jews should have no place where they can be safe. They're not safe in the countries they live in around the world, and they shouldn't be safe in the one country that they can call a home. And that's why the project is to try and dismantle it. This sort of line about, we don't have a problem with Jews, we have a problem with Zionists, that's sort of like me saying, I have a problem with Muslims, I have a problem with Islamists. It's rhetorical. It's quite clear that there's an enormous overlap between Jews and Zionists. There are Christians who are Zionists as well, and I note that organizations like the Mandela Foundation have declared war on Christian Zionists, and that's a betrayal of Mandela's own values, who himself was a Zionist and thought that Israel had a right to exist.
All right. Thank you very
Okay.
much. Stop.
The majority of Zionists are are American Christians. They're the majority. So why do you associate Zionists with being Jews? You could be anyone and be a Zionist. But the problem is, Bethlehem, that's a lie. Consult any Palestinian Christian. And there's actually multiple churches based in Bethlehem that have condemned the Israel persecution. They say the reason why Christians are leaving is because of Israeli occupation of Palestinian Christians. Don't lie. You're right, don't lie. So imagine someone saying, oh, you black South Africans, you have all kinds of black African countries to go to. Why do you have to be here? You just don't like the Boers to have the only Boer state in Africa or in the world. That's what you sound like. That's the ridiculousness of that argument. Palestinians are Arabic speakers, but they're natives. Egyptians are Arabs, but they don't come from Arabia. They're the descendants from the pharaohs and from the ancient Egyptians. Palestinians are natives. Why should they go somewhere else? It seems you secretly support Benjamin Netanyahu's idea. The only solution is expulsion. I said another expulsion of the Palestinians. No, sir. No.
30 seconds. All right. Let's move on to our next question. Thank you very much.
Question for Mr. Andalusi is, why is this war in Gaza the priority issue for almost all Muslim activism or public speaking that I hear, at the same time that other things are happening in the world? For example, 1 million Muslims imprisoned in China. I haven't heard any Muslim leader object to that. Secondly, one's had 1.5 million people killed this century, most of them Muslims in Yemen, Syria, and Sudan. I don't hear much about that.
Time.
But also just with the alliance with woke people who are advocating killing of unborn people, children, who I understand is completely against Muslim teaching, but they're happy to work with these people. So my question is, why is that the paramount issue?
Scott, over to you.
Okay. Why is it when there's so many countries around the world where people are being oppressed, massacred, denied the right to vote, why does the world focus on South Africa, part of South Africa, so much to the point that they were actually suspended, de facto suspended from the UN? No other country has been suspended from the UN. Why are you picking on white South Africa? Because it purports to be a liberal democracy. And if you can allow a liberal democracy to deny the rights of a people and still be a liberal democracy, that's a threat to liberal democracies everywhere on principle. So that's why Israel is quite an exceptional state, because it's the only state that gets $4 billion plus from America on money, no sanctions from any Western state, and it denies it's based on racial supremacy. So China doesn't say it's based on racial supremacy. Neither does Russia. They do horrible things, but Israel is based on racial supremacy. So that's why we talk about it. And of course, anyone would talk about it. You know, I want to just segue into something else, which is, we talked about denazification of Germany. That was the solution. But all Germans, at the end of denazification, got to be part of one state and could all equally vote. At the end of whatever process he wants with the Palestinians, he denies the Palestinians a right of equality, and he denies them their own state. Benjamin Netanyahu said they won't get their own state. So what? Where is the only solution for the Palestinians? It seems like the only solution that you want for the Palestinians is a final solution.
Thanks very much. Mark, would you like to respond?
So a couple of thoughts. The one is that the real reason why you don't find discussions of the persecution of Muslims by states like China or by other Muslims is that it's only news when they are Jews, that there's a sort of selective problem here. I don't see much sort of ranting and raving about other states that are, ethnically arranged. I don't hear claims that the Greeks shouldn't be allowed to be a state for Greeks only, or they shouldn't have a right of return for Greeks. So I think that sort of would explain the sort of the emphasis issue. Just remind me of the last point that you made.
Well, I said that you deny the Palestinians a one-state equal solution. They're denied a separate state, as you just argued. So what's left for them?
Yeah, so my view is that if you did have a thorough denazification process, and by the way, the Germans didn't live in one state, they lived in two. It was broken.
But let's say you did. Let's say you had this so-called non-denazification process that you allege the Palestinians somehow need.
Yeah.
What do you see as the solution for them? No separate state and no one state, equal rights. What's left?
30 seconds.
I think if you did have a sort of change in the population's attitudes, then you could have a separate state. And the question will be about those borders. And obviously the Israelis have been engaged.
So Gaza and the West Bank, you'd give the Gaza and West Bank back to the Palestinians.
No, I think you'd have to have a debate about what territory. You'd have to do territory swaps. You'd have to, work out.
It's
which
22%
area.
of their original homeland. You're saying that's not good. That's not enough. That's too much for them. They should have even less.
Not necessarily on the ratios of the space, but my point is that you could have 2 states. You'd have to have some discussion about where those states
Like
would be.
Bantustans, yeah?
No, it could be a contiguous.
Those are separate. South Africa considered to be separate states. Did it not? The Bantustans were separate states for the Black African people. Is that not what the apartheid government argued?
Well, the question is whether you want a Palestinian state that you think is not a Bantustan but is an autonomous state.
Okay, that's
So
our
you do it.
time
Okay,
for
yeah.
this question. We have our
Exactly.
last and final question. We have 2 more. Okay, go for it, sir.
I'm one of them. Mr. Oppenheimer, as an academic, I'd like to make a comment that I ask for your objectivity. As much as what you're accusing Hamas of doing, Irgun and Haganah did exactly the same thing against a British mandate to form the State of Israel. They committed acts of terror. I'd like you to admit that the founding of the State of Israel was on the acts of terrorism. Secondly, sir, there is a gentleman, academic like you, middle class, American physician, was named is Baruch Goldstein. He got up from the pre-dawn prayer, massacred 29 Muslims at prayer. Just like you, an academic, not an illiterate
Time.
Arab from a refugee camp. What the Israelis are doing to the Arabs is same what the Germans did to the Jews, to you all in Germany. If they kill 6 million German Jews, give them part of Germany, not part of Palestine.
Right, Mark?
So Baruch Goldstein would be an interesting case. So it's incredibly rare to have that. And 2, Baruch Goldstein is denounced by Israelis, that there's no shrine to Baruch Goldstein. That sort of shows you the difference in attitude. Whereas if you are a suicide bomber, then you are seen as a martyr for a cause, and your family will be paid, and you'll be seen as having done something heroic. So the Baruch Goldstein case shows you that Israelis condemn the killing of innocent lives, including Muslim lives, whereas Hamas, on the other hand, celebrates that kind of behavior. I think also to draw parallels between the Haganah and the Irgun versus Hamas, the methods that are used are just entirely different. You don't have the Irgun strapping, dynamite to their chests and blowing up civilians. You have attacks on the British, but to say that they're sort of equivalent groups just strikes me as detached from reality.
Thank you very much. Rustam?
Okay, so I'm going to quote from the book by Peter Bernard. He said this. A 2006 paper by 2 University of Toronto sociologists reached the conclusion that most Palestinian suicide bombers, quote unquote, gave up their lives to avenge the killing of a close relative as retribution for specific attacks against the Palestinian people or as paybacks for perceived attacks against their culture. A 2014 study by Israeli political scientists determined that among both Palestinians and Israelis, individual level exposure to terrorism and political violence against them or their families makes the subject populations less likely to support peace efforts. So clearly, violence begets violence. That's the cause of suicide bombing, which Hamas, apparently they have stopped anyway. But the Palestinians weren't the first people to invent bombing attacks against marketplaces and crowded areas. It was the Zionists. Irgun pioneered this. Menachem Begin led the Irgun. And how was Menachem rewarded? Was he punished or judged? No, he was made the 4th prime minister of Israel. That's what they do to their terrorists. Reward them.
Thank you very much. All right, we have our last and final question, sir.
Well, in the interest of time, I've decided to really write down my question.
We have 30
based
seconds,
on
sir.
what you said earlier on. Just want to probe the necklace comparison because you have used that comparison, I think, 2-3 times based on your book and before you were talking about the Baptist stance. Now, my
Time.
question is, are you aware that necklacing in South Africa was widely condemned, including by liberation leaders? Do you then accept that it was never legitimized as lawful resistance, but recognized as a mob violence and moral failure?
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Start.
I was simply quoting what this South African Jewish writer was saying, where he simply said that the expectation by the white community that there would be a genocide against whites once equality with blacks was given was unfounded. That's the only reason why I mentioned. I quoted from him. I didn't even know the full extent of necklacing. But the point is, if the argument of the white apartheid regime had been, we can only have peace with black South Africans when we eliminate the ANC and their militant wing, Umkhonto MC's way, which did do terror attacks and targeted civilian people, you wouldn't have had peace. You wouldn't have the ability for peace. So the question is, if we can create peace by giving everyone equal rights here in South Africa, and imperfect though South Africa is, why can't we do that in Palestine? And there's one major block, and it's the same block that was here in South Africa. Because people like him were afraid that the Zionists will lose with their racial supremacy in Palestine, and that's why they don't want to give people rights and freedom.
Mark, would you like to respond?
So I note there was no condemnation of the necklacings, and I haven't heard a condemnation of any of the other horrendous activities perpetrated by Hamas from my interlocutor. So I can only assume that even that this has been asked of you repeatedly, that you think there are no side constraints, that people can do all sorts of barbarous acts, immense acts of torture, of killing of civilians in the name of their just cause. And that strikes me as a terribly immoral position to hold. And it also shows your sort of lack of understanding of the South African landscape to come to an audience here and to celebrate the idea of necklacing when it has been so roundly condemned. If we look at Israel itself, you do find that you actually have a pluralist democracy where Muslims, Jews, Druze live together. They're represented within the Knesset, that you have Arab judges, that you have as Arab doctors who look after Arab patients and Jewish
30
patients.
seconds.
And so the sort of dream that you have of this pluralist society is alive in Israel. And sort of describing this as an apartheid state is to sort of not really understand what apartheid is and not to really understand what Israel is.
All right. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you kindly for attending tonight's debate. I think it was really informative. Thank you for taking the time. I know it's a Friday night. Not everybody has the time to do that. We're going to round up tonight's session, and we're going to ask each panelist to spend 5 minutes of their time to round up their opinion and their thoughts about tonight's debate. Mark, can I start with you?
So firstly, I want to say it's been a very interesting event. It's a hot topic. It's an emotional topic. I understand that people have very strong feelings about this. I'm delighted that we've managed to have a largely civil conversation, that we've been able to speak to each other, exchange ideas, hear from the crowd, engage you. I think often one of the things that's become rarer and rarer on many issues is that people only hear their side of the story. And I think it's nice that, people who've held different views and I get to hear both sides. So I really sort of celebrate what the organizers of this event have done. And I think these sort of things are well worth doing. I imagine there'll be lots of disagreement about some of the things we've said in terms of the norms that are put forward and the facts. There's a recording of this video, so people are welcome to sort of fact check each other online. I think that's probably the appropriate to do it. Ultimately, the question that was sort of asked of us today was, is the war in Gaza justified or genocide? And I've given an argument for why it sort of meets the criteria for justifiable war by looking at, the legitimate war aims of the Israelis and why what has happened doesn't meet the sort of threshold of genocide, that you don't have dota specialis. You might have had inflammatory statements that are made by various individuals, but you definitely don't have a state policy of the extermination of Palestinians as a people, either in intention or in acts. The Amalek quote, by the way, is one of those things that's sort of badly misinterpreted, in that it refers to you should remember what Amalek did to you, which refers to the Israelis being caught by surprise by Amalek and attacked, and so that's where it refers to. There's an Amalek monument outside of the International Court of Justice, and sort of Amalek is sort of referred to, like the Nazis were seen as a modern Amalek, and so Amalek refers to Hamas, not to the Palestinian people. I think we have some agreement between us, which appears to be the idea that it would be good for people who have different faiths and different beliefs to be able to live alongside each other in peace. And I think that hopefully most people feel that they want that. I'm not convinced that Hamas want that, and based on their conduct and based on what's been said in their charter and based on what's said in interviews. But it would be good to have people living alongside each other like they do in Israel. And I think, as I've said, if you did have a sort of thorough change in attitudes, you could, have other states living alongside each other, and that would be a sort of desirable state of affairs.
Are you okay? Would you?
Yeah,
with just about 2.5 minutes. Are you okay with that?
I'm okay with that.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll start over to you.
Did you say I celebrate the idea of necklacing? Did you say that? Did he say I celebrate the idea of necklacing?
No, I said that you'd refuse to denounce it.
Did he say that? Okay, then you can start my time.
Okay, go ahead.
Did I celebrate the idea of necklacing, or did I just quote a South African Jewish writer? This is as lie and slander. You lie brazenly to us as much as the government you defend lies to all of us. He said, if the white people in South Africa, the Boers were the majority, there wouldn't be apartheid in South Africa. They would just say, okay, we can all live together, no problem. Because when he says, I wouldn't mind living together, we all support the idea of living together. But what Zionism says is, sure, we can all live together as long as you are not more than us or too many. Then we don't want to live with you. We're going to bomb you. We're going to put walls around you. We're going to starve you, kill you until we expel you. That's what Zionism actually says, not what you claim it does. Notice in what he says, he's actually revealing about himself what he says. He says, he doesn't say we will give one state where Jews and Arabs and Christians and all kinds can all live together. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say one state. He said a separate state. Then he said with autonomy. Notice he didn't use the word independence, because they don't want an independent Palestinian state next to them. They want Bantustans, like the apartheid regime said, regimes which are not independent, but they are autonomous. It's a place, a concentration camp for the undesirables with a different skin color to us. That's what he wants. And Abba Eban, who the foreign minister of Israel, said, and he was the guy who pioneered the idea of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. He said not everyone gets a right to self-determination, and it should be denied the Arabs of the West Bank. So they've been quite open with what they truly believe. They don't want the Palestinians to have self-determination because, as I've said again and again and again, they want their racial supremacy in the land of Palestine, and it doesn't matter who they have to bulldoze over, literally, to get it. All right. And there was an article with Israeli soldiers mentioning to journalists that they actually literally bulldozed Palestinians in Gaza, alive and dead. So he says that Israel wants peace. It's a typical thing that the Zionists say. And yet there was multiple Arab peace initiatives. This was all the Arab world, including even the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Conference, and to the point even Iran was actually part of it, but like they said they weren't going to object, but they were like neutral about it. They said, okay, Israel, I tell you what, we will all normalize with you. Every Arab government and even the Muslim governments will all normalize relations with you, recognize your right to exist, everything, peace, and the end of any conflict. All you have to do is go back to the 1967 borders and allow the Palestinians to have their independence. Fatah said it, PLO said it, and even Hamas has said that, right? Even Hamas. And they changed their constitution in 2017, and they reiterated as a means of national unity, they said they will go with this plan. Who scuppered this deal? Israel. They said, no, we want the West Bank. We want control. We can't trust non-Jews. Because the secret behind Zionism, most people don't realize is, the premise of Zionism is that Jews must rule themselves, right? No one else can rule them. Even if they are the majority, the non-Jews, the Jews must rule themselves because ultimately you can't trust non-Jews. That's the premise of Theodor Herzl's arguments in writing. You can't trust non-Jews. So how could non-Jews be expected to live in a state where the premise of that state is that they can't be trusted and so they must be controlled? This is the basis for racial supremacy and racial subjugation. So I will end with this relating to what we discussed. There is a genocide going in Gaza, and the ANC's argument at the court case you had was that the Kill the Boer was not genocidal because no one understood it like that.
30
the
seconds.
The context was no one understood it like that. It was clear, it was metaphorical. And yet, poll after poll in Israel, for example, the Hebrew University concluded 64% of Israelis believe there are no innocents in Gaza, 47% believe that the Gaza should be conquered and everyone massacred, just like Amalek. So the Israeli people understand very well what Amalek means and what the genocidal statements of the politicians mean. It's time the whole world see through your lies and see that this is genocide and there's no hiding it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for coming through and attending this debate. Really appreciated.